All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this episode of Lean In Olympia. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Corey Passons. I do interfaith relations with Interfaith Works. Interfaith Works is a regional nonprofit serving Thurston County. We're a coalition of 30 plus diverse faith congregations and affiliated organizations. We're also one of the region's largest social service providers to vulnerable adults experiencing homelessness. We're the staffing agency at 2820 Martin Way, Unity Commons, and also at Sergio's Place, which is at 3444 Martin Way, which is a day center. You can check out all the things we're doing on our website at iwshelter.org and interfaith-works.org, or on our Facebook page or YouTube channel, and now on Spotify with this podcast. So welcome to this episode, and here we are.
Hello.
And I want to welcome our guest today, Meg Rosenberg. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to read some of the bio you sent me, which is great. So you're with Window Seat Media.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to talk today about some of the work you do, both as Window Seat Media and also what you bring to Window Seat Media, and how some of the gifts and skills you bring are happening in our community and doing archivist work, and talk about narrative today too, and some of your work you've done around that. So I'm excited to get into that. You name yourself as a public servant, which I thought was wonderful. Theater artist, community educator, deeply invested in community building and dialogue that sparks equitable social change. You have a passion for people finding the connections between each other through story. You lead Brave Practice Playback Theater Collective, an applied theater-based community engagement program of Window Seat Media. And we're going to spend some time talking about what that is today. Your professional work is focused on public and nonprofit organizational development, educational policy, workforce development. You've studied theater and interdisciplinary arts throughout middle school and high school, went to Vancouver School of Arts and Academics, and studied theater, anthropology, and sociology, and French during undergrad at Kalamazoo College, and a Master of Public and Nonprofit Administration from the Evergreen State College in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we could go on.
It's so weird to have my bio read back to me. Thanks for doing that.
Oh, you bet. No, it's a great joy to share it back to you. I want to read just one more thing that you shared with us, that you work at the intersection of arts, education, and equitable public administration. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll see a lot of these themes come out as we talk about some of the theory behind the work that you're doing. And one other thing I might mention too is you have a background in diversity, equity, inclusion, social and emotional learning strategies, and you are a community weaver with Window Seat Media. And before we go any farther, did you tell me about this title, Community Weaver? Where did it exist before you got there? Did you develop it with? And you have a colleague you might want to introduce as well.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, thanks for all of that. So I started in Window Seat Media in 2021. My colleague, Elaine Rosenberg, is the founder. So we've been around since 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a background in oral history and folklore. She's a folklorist and oral historian. And so her title that we've come to is memory activist, right? And so it's the process of we live in of listen, learn, activate, of listening and gathering community oral histories, training folks to be community oral historians, learning from the wisdom that is gathered in that process, and then activating. And so Elaine was already doing so much of that work, especially in the listening and learning component as an oral historian, sort of archival and figuring out what the gaps in our community archives are, and then filling those gaps and training community members to be able to tap that knowledge and wisdom and that non-institutional knowledge and wisdom that exists locally. And so that's what the organization has been for quite some time, is this local public history resource, community resource, both for our own public programming, and then also folks can hire us as a resource for capacity building for their own storytelling work. And so my background as a theater artist and as a public administrator and working in education, while I'm not a certified educator, I've been teaching and learning and in that active process of critical engagement forever and want to be. But I love community, right? I'm an extrovert. Elaine is an introvert. And so we complement each other in that way. We've had this very introverted leader for quite some time. And I'm coming on and being like, let's activate all this stuff. So Brave Practice is the program that I brought with me. And I was involved with the organization before officially coming on as staff because I was facilitating. During the pandemic, we were doing these virtual community storytelling circles. And so Elaine and I had worked together. And then I'm a longtime member of the Heart Sparkle Players, which is a group locally that does playback theater. Debbie Eden was a founding board member of Window Seat Media and is also the artistic director of the Heart Sparkle Players, and connected Elaine and I. And so there was a storytelling circle around a play I wrote. So I've been in community with this organization for a while and loving the way that we're sort of activating community stories and the tool of playback, how that's already sort of woven into a way that personal stories can be brought to the forefront in community. And so when this position opened up, I applied for it. And, I went through the formal process. But during the interview, like I had just graduated in 2018 from Evergreen in the Masters of Public Administration program. And there's a lot of, it's Evergreen. And so you can sort of bring yourself to your degree. And there's a core program, but you can craft through independent learning and through community learning internships and such, like what you want to bring to your degree. And so I have this background in theater and I've always loved it. And then I had, a number of years as playback. And so my senior thesis was all about using playback theater as a tool for public administration and bringing playback into spaces where maybe theater isn't the tool that you're using to activate community building, right? And so I walked out of my degree program with a business plan, ready to be a nonprofit administrator using theater in some way. And that just in the course of conversation felt really, really aligned to what Elaine was already doing. And in that cycle of listen, learn, activate, I bring the activate, right? And we do both, right? We both kind of weave in and out. I can also support the folklore and the the interviewing parts, right? Like as I've come into leadership in the playback theater world. There's various roles in a production, right? There's an actor, there's a musician, there's the audience who are active participants invited to tell moments or true stories, and then there's the role of the conductor, who's sort of the space holder, the facilitator. And that's the role that Debbie typically will play in Heart Sparkle. And I've grown into that role, right? And so coming into this role at Window Seat has allowed me to step into being a leader on stage and hold equitable spaces for community dialogue in collaboration with the other work that we're doing. And
I want to get to the specifics of what that looks like, in terms of some of the projects, and we'll cover not all the projects, but some of them that y'all are working on at Window Seat. And but I wanted to ask first if you could just help us know a little more about you, like where you're from. Where did you start to move towards theater? What was your journey towards that place of fascination with community, with narrative, with theater?
Man, I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't drawn to theater. So like you said in my bio, I grew up in Vancouver, Washington, went to Vancouver School of Arts and Academics. The SAA is a interdisciplinary arts and academics 6th through 12th grade school.
Oh, wow.
So since I was a middle schooler, I've been in an environment, a public school that was promoting intentional intersectional learning. So I can tell you about mitosis and meiosis through the lens of having made an animation about it, right? Like this, like that's sort of how my brain works, and was really supported from a young age. And also I'm a younger sibling, and my sister is also very introverted and likes literary arts and band and visual arts and sort of things where she's, you know, I've just wanted to do the opposite of her in a lot of ways. And so theater is very like out and about and, you know, just like in my younger years, looking for a way to belong. That looked like looking for validation for a long time. And instead now it looks like making space for a community of people to validate one another.
Yeah, I remember my own experience in high school. I wasn't deeply involved in drama, but I did through band and other things. I was near those circles, and I do remember just a sense of welcome among the people who were really involved in it. And I really appreciated that about you. Use the word belonging, and I recognized that in that community there.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's belonging and not belonging, right? Wanting so badly to belong and be good at a thing. And then there's the competitive part that comes with theater and that comes with going to an art school, right? And so I don't think I really found myself or found my voice until college. And it was necessary for me to leave and go far away and kind of get more worldly experience and meet a diversity of folks, right? And just kind of like have my lens complexified. And also, like, I can trace back to my junior year in high school project where I, like, looked up theater for community building and led a workshop with 6th graders, right? Like, I can, like, track, like, Brave Practice back to, like, drama therapy, to psychodrama, to the things that I was, like, trying to name what they were. And always really, like, rejecting the competitive part of theater or, like, the part that said, you're not good enough, because I was never cast as, like, the ingenue. And I really hated having to compete with my peers about getting a role. And so I think when I found playback, when I found belonging but theater people who were using it as a tool to come into community together versus to silo and to separate, like it was like finding my people, you know? And that's all I want to keep doing, you know?
Amazing. And who at that time, did you have any role models that were helping you? Like you mentioned this particular search you could go back to. Who was demonstrating this model that feels really nuanced in some ways, this community-based sense of drama? Were you seeing that anywhere, or were there examples that were helping you to imagine that? I mean, how did it come into your sense of your scope?
A little bit, not until Debbie, not until moving to Olympia and doing the Heart Sparkle Players.
So there were more energies that came together and coalesced later on.
Yeah, and so there was this like, I went to a pretty traditional liberal arts school. Kalamazoo College has an amazing theater program, but it's very small. And you know, theater was my degree, but it's a liberal arts degree, and so you're not just getting acting; you're getting across the board.
Yeah.
And you know, I loved all of my faculty and my theater teacher in high school, but the lens was always sort of like, this is what theater looks like. Like it's this, here's a play, here's a season, it's in repertory, like it's on the stage. Someone gets cast. Like this is what theater looks like. Right.
Yeah.
But then it was like the introduction of theater of the oppressed, right? We learned, I took like a theater for community building class and like read a book that was like, wait, what? But didn't actually like get to put it into practice until I joined Heart Sparkle Players. But the interest was always there. And then I thought I wanted to be a therapist for a while. Like the understanding that you could use drama for therapy, right? Like psychodrama was very fascinating for a while. I don't want to be a therapist anymore, right? The thing about playback theater is it's entertaining, not entertainment, therapeutic, not therapy, right? I like don't walk into a space and expect like healing may happen, but that's not, I'm not here to heal, right? We're here to listen, to understand, and make space for what needs to happen.
Well, let's use that last listening and making space for what wants to happen. Let's briefly go towards some of the ways that window seat media functions. And there's a lot that could be explored from the website, but I want to just focus in mostly on some purpose statements and then move towards some of the projects in particular and your involvement with them. one of the things on the website that says that we believe we write our future with the stories we narrate. And we are committed to co-creating a more inclusive, connected, and just world. So this concept of narrative is central to what you all are supporting and exploring. Window Seat Media is a local nonprofit in Olympia, but it goes on to talk about oral history and personal narrative are at the center of our work. And we're going to get to some of those expressions with that. And it also mentions how you've experimented with different formats. And I mean, media itself is a constantly emerging expression. And how do we share stories? How do we tell them? Window Seat has focused on histories. You mentioned non-commercialized or non-institutionalized histories in our area. And that eventually comes back to people's experiences and their stories. So do you want to say anything about that before we move into specific projects that Window Seat's working on?
I mean, I think that the concept of narrative is an incredibly powerful framework. I feel like narrative is an entryway into critical thinking. If you're thinking about narratives as the way that we understand and make meaning, right? Like narratives of what is good, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, like how we understand what values exist in a community is a narrative ultimately. And if we can dissect those things and understand that they can be changed or retold or communicated again, or that the people who told them in the first place are the people with power, right? Where does power live in that dynamic? Then there's a lot of power to write our own future, right? And there's less counting on somebody else to write it for us.
Well, the power piece, and it's one of the reasons why I really appreciate starting these episodes that I do and lean in with narrative, with learning about your narrative and sharing where you're from, because I think oftentimes we live in ideas and concepts and power structures. Narrative is a project of connection and also of and time too. It takes time to get to know someone's story as well, and our sense of time is monetized in society, and so slowing down and taking time for narrative is also a countercultural thing these days as well.
And just in terms of like working with educators or students, like personal narrative doesn't have a place in the classroom, right? And so just simply the act of like asking someone, what was a moment from your day or week? Like, how was your morning? How are you, not even just how are you doing, but like storytelling specific language or like, where are you from? Like those kinds of questions are sometimes they just make space for themselves in a classroom and they take up time and they feel like a nuisance, and they shouldn't, right? Because they're going to happen anyway. And so if we can find ways in our everyday life to make space for the personhood that exists and the community that's there, then the learning can also happen.
Which is so needed because we're so siloed. And this is one of the, coming out of the pandemic, it's just shown even a brighter light on the way that people feel disconnected from one another. And in our interfaith work that we do, and in Interfaith Works, one of the things that we hold up is narrative at our program council meetings with the gathering of delegates from all these different communities. We take time for people to share individual stories of their own journey, their own faith journey, and that helps us to remember that we're not just one glom thing. We're a constellation of individuals, and it takes time for us to get to know each other as individuals. Yeah. And then also with people experiencing homelessness, the empowerment of being seen and witnessed. And that's when you're able to tell your story and be seen, that's an empowering human moment.
Yeah. And just in terms of like the way as an organization we position ourselves as story stewards, right? There is a certain amount of power that Elaine and I have just as staff of an organization that claims to be able to support storytelling in the community. And so we have a model where the vast majority of the time we're teaching other people how to be interviewers, how to go out into their own community to either tell their own story or gather stories of folks that are already within their community. So it's very rare that I walk around with a microphone and ask people about themselves.
Where you're mostly empowering other people to find those stories and to get them themselves.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to some specific examples of this, and we're gonna end up with the Brave practice playback. In a few minutes, we'll move towards that. But I want to start with community roots. If you could tell us a little bit about what this is, and people can find these on your website too. Which can you help? Was it windowseatmedia.org?
Yeah, it's windowseatmedia.org.
Okay, thanks. So this is one of the projects that's accessible, and can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. And so I mentioned before we run our own projects, and then we also do consulting, essentially. And so we have currently 3 ongoing what we call community narratives. So that's where you can find them on our website. One is Community Roots. And so that is a project that Elaine has stewarded for quite some time. It grew out of another project called The Third 30, which was specifically focused on amplifying the voices of Southtown elders. And then a lot of the through lines in that story were about art and activism and this spirit of innovation that exists locally. And so that's the spirit of Community Roots is local activist organizers and folks who have made significant change in the community. And
is it a current project? Is it ongoing?
The current project is ongoing. So this most recent cohort of Community Roots has chosen 3 brand new stories, and this is an ongoing project. And so after this round, there will be more stories to add to the narrative. So that theme of where does social change come from and how is it possible is the uniting factor. And there's the 3 stories are, one, there used to be the Liberation Cafe above Bulldog News, and it was only around for a couple of years, but it was a pretty powerful space of collective organizing and resources. The other was Camp Quixote, which is, sorry, I don't know why, it's fancy.
Yeah.
But then that was the first tent city that existed visibly in our downtown area, and that has over time turned into the nonprofit Quixote communities. But it was like that first moment of folks gathering around a community in need and coming together and problem solving. Like that was the first idea around a tent city or a tiny home city. And so it's like, what can we learn from those discoveries that are in this continuing critical issue for our community? So that's the second one. And then the third, Driftwood Daycare, the Evergreen State College, back in the late 60s, early 70s, as women were coming back into the workforce, there's large need for childcare on campus. The childcare center originally came about as just support for faculty, but then it was students were like, we also need this. And so it's just this like response to community need for childcare and understanding of childcare as an equity issue, right? As a barrier or an access issue for higher education. So these 3 stories are happening in the same community, and they have intersecting people, timelines, right? And so the exhibit that we're planning right now for Community Roots is these 3 stories in conversation with each other. And our cohort has gathered, a number of community interviews. And then there's also ephemera. The Evergreen student who worked in the childcare center who brought us the story of the Driftwood Daycare, there was a box of ephemera that she just was like, this cannot go to waste. Like, I have to do something with it. And so she's been working with us and also getting credit through Evergreen to put on, to basically do the archival work.
Ephemera being
bits and bobs, items, pictures, articles from capturing
that time.
A story.
And that will be part of the visual presentation of the audio.
Yeah, when you think of an exhibit, like what's
Where will
in an
that
exhibit? We don't know yet.
We don't know. Okay.
We're putting together a crowdfunding campaign specifically for the exhibit.
Yeah.
The first round of the project was sponsored by the American Historical Association. We got a pretty generous grant from the HA to grow the Third 30 into community roots. And then also as part of that, that's what sort of launched Stories of Food as Stories as well. And now they're branching into 2 separate projects. And so we're doing our, we also have a cycle, an annual cycle of fundraising too, as a nonprofit, both general operating and project specific.
Yeah.
We're public administrators.
Do you have
right?
a rough timeline of when that might, or when you're hoping that would be?
And in the early winter.
Oh, so soon.
Yeah, soon. Yeah. So crowdfunding campaign ASAP. And then, hopefully it will, these are stories that the community wants to hear.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so we're hoping that it will be something that in the way that things that get funded are things that the community is asking for. Like that's the relationship that we want to be in, is like in response to what needs to be told, right? So these are stories that have emerged from the community that we're hoping that our community will come behind. And we have, a track record of success when it comes to bringing to the table something that the community is going to be excited about.
So we'll look for that then in the upcoming, half year or so. And that's really exciting.
Absolutely.
That's great. And you also referenced, as you were describing community roots, Stories of Food, and you mentioned that there was some connection there. Could you give just an overview of what that is, and then maybe what are those connection tendrils back into the other project?
Yeah, so Stories of Food is all about foodways. Yum. Foodways as an entryway into personal storytelling, and all of this from a folklore lens. You have oral traditions, right? And our humanness culture has folklore, expressions of our folk life. And then oral history is this process of documentation, right? Of understanding what's in the archive, what's not in the archive, and then actively making creative products or historical documentation that then is available for the community. So, with Stories of Food, it was another a cohort model where we're training folks in the process of, okay, so you're now going to go into your own community or your family and conduct an interview. And then from that interview, we also we collaborated with 3 different teaching artists to do creative products. And so there was a group zine, and then there was the individual interviews. One person was already working on a cookbook as part of their own independent contract.
Like a regional person?
Evergreen, another student.
Okay, cool.
So we're having a lot of interaction with students, getting credit for their work. We're also a clock hour provider, and so we can offer educator clock hours. And so there's really good just sort of support in terms of folks being able to I don't want to... legitimize is the word that's coming to my mouth right now, but it's not that, right? It's uplifting of non-institutional knowledge. And that's an intentional thing where it's like your family history is important and deserves to be documented, and you are the right person to do that.
Yeah, because they're not necessarily those folks who are acting in that way of like a cultural history or a family history particular to food. They're not acting in active comparison to some agribusiness or some other chain. They're just living out the tradition of their family or their land.
Right.
So that's
exactly what you're saying. Yeah, and what was really cool about that is just the community collaborations, and we moved all over the city. Like we were over at Osho, the Cultural Community Center in Tumwater. We went over to traditions. And so food places in town that could also be community gathering spaces. Chef Krishita cooked for us, as well as a couple other.
Lucky you.
I know, right? Yeah. As well as a number of other community food.
Yeah.
Amazing humans.
Yeah.
And then we had panels, right? Panels of people such as Tuna Worth Creamery and Grub, like folks who are like living the foodways life, right? Like that's not my area of expertise, and it was just really beautiful to see that that's how people are are finding this way into discovering who they are, right?
Yeah, and that through line though, like narrative and food. I mean, two of the most tried mechanisms of connection.
Absolutely.
That's just, and the two are also almost always like intertwined,
Yes.
right? Stories over food helping stories to come out. So this is amazing.
Right. And, there's a lot of intentionality around like a folklore lens, right? Which is like everyone has folk life. As like I'm a white person, so I'm going to speak right now from my experience. There are narratives that white people are the neutral, right? That my perspective, my food, my life has been the norm. And that's just simply not true. And so when I put my perspective in the context of, for example, Dr. Zurita Hammond's culture tree, which has like surface level culture, mid-level culture, deep culture, or an understanding of like a power and privilege wheel, or Dr. Robin DiAngelo has like your frames of reference, right? Like race, class, all of those things, like those come into telling your personal stories, right? And so, and we include this folk life framework as well as some of these tools that I just mentioned when it comes to how can each person see themselves and find their narrative in this project, right? I wouldn't want a white person to come to this project and be like, well, I'm just here for passive observation because I don't have culture, because that's just incorrect. And I also don't want, anyone, and especially our BIPOC community members, to come to the table and feel tokenized in any way. So it's about, who are you? Let's celebrate the differences that bring us together, right? And those differences are the key. We can't not look at them. We can't escape them, right? Like the differences are how we find connection.
Yeah, and that's, I agree with that. And there's also, I think, ways that differences can be recognized that are helpful, in some ways that can actually cause harm or difficulty in connection too. And I might want to use that crux there to pivot into the Brave practice playback, if we could. So this is one of the current projects that we're working on, and one of the ways that I was just referencing about understanding is what I was talking about, understanding differences, and in the interfaith world, I mean, this is critical. Coming to a sense of appreciation for another person without the expectation of them becoming or recognizing you in any way as having authority over or a better system or anything like that. It's about appreciating differences. And my understanding of some of the intentions behind Brave practice playback are to foster understanding, but I want to have you describe it first before I go any farther with that.
Sure.
So could you give us kind of an overview of what Brave Practice Playback Theater Collective is, and then we can talk about some of the theory, which I think we'll see very easily connects with some of the earlier work that we've been talking about.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing that this Brave practice has developed its life, and that we have this cohort of, or this group of theater teaching artists, creative people who are continuing to come together. Like it's a dream, because we get to have that. We get to create that community culture that we want to see, and come into relationship with each other in the way that, like, actually living into what belonging can look like, right? And so there's a specific commitment to having, like, as a company, to being a multicultural, intergenerational company and doing professional development together, and intentionality around who's on stage, and how we're holding story, right? Like playback as an art form has specific ritual involved, and we've developed community agreements for when folks come into space together. They know what they're walking into, and they know sort of what the asks are ahead of time, right? Our community agreements are share true stories, listen deeply to one another, lean into community wisdom, and take some brave risks, right? And then if it's a workshop setting, we might add something around confidentiality, right? Share the message, not the messenger.
When does this happen? Under what circumstances is the playback instigated, or why would it function, or where?
Either in a workshop setting or a performance setting. So as a company, we're a community resource for storytelling. And so if in a performance, like say there's a group of people, any group, we would do some sort of introduction of the players, the people that are on stage, because we all have like coming to the performance with our own stories. There's typically a theme or central idea that then the conductor, and in most cases that's me, but we also have another conductor, Hiroko, in our troupe. And what's cool about the troupe is that Hiroko has 35 years of playback theater experience, you know? So like we're constantly learning from one another. But the conductor does a lot of that framing, right? So like, this is who we are. Here, what we do is something called sociometry. And so it's sort of visualizing and mapping who's in the room, right? Who's seen playback theater before, who's familiar with the topic that we're talking about. Like, how have you participated and come to today's experience? Like, what are you coming to today's experience with? And then there's an introduction of the theme, and then the invitation for folks to share true stories. And typically the beginning of a performance will be short moments and we practice forms together. So there's different narrative forms that can hold kinds of stories. And as a conductor, it's my job to choose which form is going to hold the story. And so I'll hear the story. We'll have a little mini interview.
Someone will offer to share a story that's pressing or a part of their...
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
And then I'll turn to the team and I'll say, let's watch. And then we'll see a playback of the story. So everyone in the room has witnessed the story, the playback, and then the turn to, if you told the story, you would be called the teller. And so it's always this, as a conductor and the acting team will turn back to you and I'll ask, did that capture the spirit of your story?
How many people are reflecting back to me or playing back to me?
Typically a performance team will be 3 to 5 people.
So I'm telling the story, the 3 to 5 play it back to me, they act it back, and then you would ask me what? If it was accurate, would I just...
Yeah. And everyone has heard you tell the story. So it's an artistic interpretation of it, the emotions and the essence of what you've told, right? It's a way to get to that core. What are the values there? What are the beliefs there? What's underneath? And you were talking about the theory. Like, I love the way that playback really like takes narrative and community narrative and then puts it into this container of the theory behind that. So the founders of playback theater are Jonathan Fox and Joe Salas, and the theory that they talk about is called narrative reticulation. Reticulation, from my understanding, is like the veins in a leaf. So it's like the way that like life gets to the different parts of the leaf. And so narrative reticulation would be like, I tell a story and then it comes back to me, right? And so it's like it prompts your story. The core of my story prompts your story, which then prompts the next person's story, which then prompts the next person's story. So there's a red thread woven throughout the stories that then we can think about the theme through the lens of all these different stories.
Not knowing what the theme is when you start, right?
I mean, I'll plant as a conductor. You plant little seeds.
Okay, you plant seeds.
You plant seeds, right? And oftentimes the performance will have a title, you know, like our workshop series. So we have we've done a couple different Brave Practice has a couple different offerings. So in the past, we've partnered with Together in schools, and as well as with Osho Cultural Community Center, and this is our 3rd year at Osho, and we're going to have our kickoff workshop for all ages coming up on October 15th. So that's going to kick off a workshop series at Osho where we're going to basically teach playback theater and no previous experience necessary, right? But it's this understanding of like, how does this thing work, right? Because it works to various degrees, to depending on, you know, the container and the people and whatever. But there's typically some level of vulnerability that happens, and typically some level of sharing that happens.
What a different world. I mean, to have young children, you're talking about grade school age kids?
Middle high school.
Yeah. Even still, folks, and many of us who, even after the pandemic, the communication has been brokered through screens even more than ever. And to have to like engage with the humanity of a person and the way that they want to be heard and the way they want to be received in terms of what you understand from them. I mean, that kind of communication can only happen in a room together. It's incredible.
Well, you think.
Oh, okay.
But
there's more.
During the pandemic, playback went online.
How'd it go?
It worked great. It works great. We didn't think it would, and it still works.
The live element is there.
The live element is there. Yeah, it needs to be live.
yeah.
But, you know.
Versus a brokered like comments in response to a post or something along those lines as a type of communication.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't work. It's not as satisfying, I think, as a live performer, right? Like I've chosen to not be on the screen. But there were different interesting opportunities, online, as well as specifically the playback community is international. And so like I got to be in a class with people in Brazil, people in Hong Kong, people in the Philippines. It was just like all over the world. Various time zones. We're all just like groggy, learning together. And I got conductor certified over Zoom.
Okay. Amazing. And so the next expression is happening at Osho for playback, and that's coming up. You said next.
It's gonna be October. Sunday the 15th. Yeah. I think it's the 15th.
I think so. Yeah.
And we just solidified that today, but that'll be the first in this series of stories of bravery. So that was the connection, was like you were asking what's the theme.
Yeah.
This is the first time we sort of themed the whole season. But that's the theme that we come back to, right? As brave practice, and that came from, I have a background as a camp outdoor education person. And so like thinking about challenge courses, right? There was this way that we used to talk about the rock wall, where what's in your comfort zone, what's in your learning zone, what's in your danger zone. And as you're climbing the rock wall, like the ground is your comfort zone, you want to feel the edge of your learning zone. And for brave practice, this is your brave zone, right? You want to like be living inside this learning brave zone. But if you feel yourself getting into your danger zone, like that's like we don't want to go there, right? And it's that self-awareness that says, I know what bravery is for me, and I can take care of myself or ask others to support me in the way that I need to get back into my learning zone.
Yeah.
And by practicing that, like that self-mitigation and also that asking for what you need, like that is practicing bravery, and so it's easier outside.
It's an amazing invitation to get to know that margin and where you're coming toward it. Even to ask people to move into that space of the brave space is maybe not a zone that a lot of people find themselves in. And so to be invited into that in a container that's designed to help you thrive in that zone versus feeling unsupported or potentially risky there, that's a really deeply community building effort that you're doing with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, because we talked a bit earlier when you're getting here today about a concept of belonging. And I wanted to sort of move towards that. The idea of meeting another person through their story, the way they tell it, in my experience, is one of the most powerful ways of developing belonging and connection between people. And I wanted to talk about some of your work with this conference you went to, the Art of Belonging, Arts and Migrant Education Conference. First of all, could you talk about how you see the work that you do with the Brave practice as do you see connections with that and belonging?
Yes.
Where do you see those connections?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Arts and Migrant Conference was interesting because it was the first time those two offices of OSPI have done a combined conference. So the Arts Office of the Office of Superintendent for Public Instruction, and then the Arts and Migrant Office. So typically they've been two separate conferences, and this time they were together. And so it was an interesting like experiment, and they're gonna do it again. And so as an artist and intersectional thinker, it was like an exciting challenge, and also like a gift to be given. Like this is who your audience is, right? And especially with the work that we already do with this folk life lens and oral history and storytelling as a tool for elevating stories that aren't often told, right? It just sort of fit really well.
Feels like that, yeah.
And to be able to work with educators and brainstorm ideas for how those things can be brought into the classroom, right? And how to empower students to both be telling their own story, whether it's for their college essay or whether it's for, to be able to go home and talk to a parent about their life, right? And open up a dialogue of life stories that may maybe not have been shared beforehand.
From the parents, maybe?
Yeah. Stories of migration, stories of hardship, stories of belonging, right? Like what does it actually, we're in Yakima, right? So what does it, how did those people come to that place? Like all of those things like are potentially invisible, especially in a school environment oftentimes, and the differences that students are bringing with their backgrounds. So yeah, I mean, I think playback for sure is always going to be doing that because it's elevating stories. But I do think that any sort of oral tradition will do that.
Yeah.
Will invite belonging into a space because of just that, like, it's so like that permission to bring yourself into the space. With an intentionally culturally responsive approach, I had attempted to like portray myself as a cultural being in one of my slides, right? I had like 20 pictures of who I want to, the narrative of who Meg is, right? Like Meg in college, Meg in high school, Meg in yoga, Meg in getting married, right? Here's all of Meg. And also just sort of point out, you see, this is who I am as a cultural being, and also this is the narrative that I've chosen to paint for you.
Yeah.
What is missing?
Okay.
You know,
you asked what is missing.
What's missing? Yeah.
Did you hear any surprises back, or what did you hear?
I mean, they don't know me. But the next slide is, okay, when I start with myself, I can make room for others, because then I can ask, okay, how many of you also have a sibling? How many of you also were not born in this state? How many of you also, I don't know, whatever connection to highlight both difference and point of connection. Yeah.
Wow. Just I'm really happy with you sharing your work today. And I'm wondering if you could tell us what else is coming up for you specifically in Window Seat. You mentioned the two projects. Are those the main points of focus for you right now as we look ahead, like in the next 6 months for Window Seat?
That and Give Local.
Give Local, okay.
Yep. Yeah. So Give Local through the South Puget Sound Community Foundation is happening in November. So this is the second year we're participating in Give Local. And so that really helps us out with those what we call general operating funds, right? So they aren't allocated to a specific project. It helps with basically helping us be really nimble and flexible and responsive to what the community is asking for. So Give Local is a huge way that folks can support us. But also just like come to the workshop. It's all ages. It's so fun.
Oh, I don't know if I heard that before. It's all age, so it's intergenerational.
Yeah. So throughout the Brave Practice series, there'll be specific ages. So we've experimented with some formats. This is the format we're trying out this year. The kickoff workshop will be intergenerational. There will be a middle school specific one, a high school specific one, a young adult specific one, so college folks, and then another intergenerational one at the very end of the season that anyone who played or came and practiced throughout the season can come join.
And where can we get in touch with the schedule of these offerings for that? Is that
the one that is scheduled is October 15th,
and then subsequent ones following that?
Yes. And I will have them up on our website as soon as I know what the rest of the schedule is. But I know that there will be, that's the progression, and it'll be throughout the school year, September through May. Okay,
thank you. I just am so optimistic about the community benefit that playback can offer, and the ways that it fosters connection and narrative in a time where it seems like narrative is collapsing to in belonging, and as a form of excluding others versus opening to others, and in a time where we are becoming siloed within our stories from each other. What you're doing is kind of subverting that and introducing vulnerability, so that people have their story as a way of widening the welcome versus like shutting the door.
Yeah.
So what you're doing, I think, is I want to just lift it up and thank you for that work, which is that example is really needed in this moment.
Yes.
In this very moment.
Thank you. And folks can always contact Window Seat Media. You can invite Brave Practice into your organization or group. You can also invite me or Elaine to do a one-off workshop or a storytelling circle or consult. We love being in community. That, like, you mentioned being a public servant. Like, that's an intentional.
Well, you mentioned being a public.
Well, I mentioned it, and then you reiterated it. Yeah, but that service, right?
Yeah.
A service framework or being a servant for the public it's not something I take lightly, right? Like, I have a deep commitment to showing up for my community in a way that is equitably distributing public resources, and that's what public administration should be, and that's what nonprofit administration should be. Our nonprofit sector is broken in a lot of ways, and expects volunteer labor, expects those who are furthest from justice to be doing a lot of the work, and that's just not appropriate, right? And so where can we disrupt that? Where can we be distributing resources more equitably? Where can we be asking those with an abundance to really show up, so those without don't have to? And so you'll see that in our sliding scale cost model. You'll see that just organizationally, like, take equity really seriously, as a organizational development and strategic planner, I really like this work.
No, I appreciate that final reflection too, back on how nonprofits can actually reflect some of the inequity that is actually a critique from nonprofit, oftentimes towards capitalist or for-profit industries, but they can be expressed in different ways in the nonprofit world. So. As we're wrapping up, I always love to end, and sorry if I'm just dropping you on this as a surprise, but as an example of hope, where would you point to an example of hope in this world? Or if you'd like to, in addition to that, talk about how you understand hope to help us get more in touch with your example.
I look to my elders and to the young people for hope. And I feel like I always have, as I was young and as I'm getting older, I'm like right in the middle of being a millennial. So I feel like oftentimes I'm like looking up at the boomers and just like wondering like what, and then like looking down at Gen Z and just like what, and I think there's actually a lot to learn there from just like trying to put myself in their shoes of like the context that they've grown up in. Especially like the young folks are so smart. Like, I didn't come out till I was 22. I'm so gay. I wish I would have come out when I was 14, like these kids can. And they've got the words and they've got the pronouns and they're just so smart and they're so systems aware. I think this like systems perspective of like, how can I put my finger on this policy and make a change, right? And it's not this change making is not a nebulous thing. It's like, that's where the change is happening and I'm putting myself in that room. That's who I see their young people as. And the older generation, I just have so many gifts of elders who have like loved on me and cultivated me and been mentors. Debbie specifically is just someone who her life path is now about being a mentor and about giving back. And that's who I want to be. You know, I just want to be somebody who just learns to be able to give.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Really appreciate that final piece you just offered there. It's a wonderful tie back into the mentors who have grown you, who grow us in the work that we do and connect us. Their narratives are a part of your narrative now too. So.
Oh yeah. If the Heart Sparkle Players is the roots of a tree, Brave Practice is the branches of the tree. Like we are connected, we support each other. Like it's incredible the way that this community has helped not just me evolve, but I see so many people around me really being able to make change.
Great. And again, it's windowseatmedia.org for people to get in touch with the flow of that work. And you have a social media presence too well.
We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. Also, Brave Practice has its own little Facebook page. But our website, and do sign up for our newsletter because that's you'll be most up to date there.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Meg Rosenberg has been our guest today. Really appreciate you coming by. Again, this has been Lean In Olympia. Thank you all for joining us today. This is a bi-weekly podcast from Interfaith Works. You can check us out on our Facebook page or our website at interfaith-works.org and on Spotify, where you can stay up to date with all of the most recent episodes from this podcast. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate you, Meg, for coming by. Be well. We'll see you next time.